Is the mic a little bit too loud for you all? Can you hear me fine? Good. Okay, perfect. I believe our curator, Mrs. Karen Gore, was going to say a couple of things before I would get started. She'll be with us shortly.
Appreciate you coming out, and I just want to tell you, you are in for a special treat. Joseph Williams and his mother came by here last summer to visit the depot, and then Joseph called a couple months ago and asked if he could spend his summer here, just being at the depot. And so he is a junior at Appalachian State University, and he's studying history and social studies. And he's been working here since June, and just after 2 days of studying the exhibits and doing his own research at home, he was giving tours to visitors. He has continued his research along with meeting people connected to the exhibits and the history of the depot, and he's compiling information for us to use when he goes back to college. Joseph is not getting college credit for this. He just loves and has a passion for history, and he has made it his goal to know everything about a museum that his time allows. His ability to remember the names and dates is phenomenal, and he has been committed to digging out the true and accurate facts in his research. I know you're going to enjoy this thoroughly researched presentation on the legendary Sam Potts by Joseph Nathaniel Williams.
Very kind of you. Some very kind words from Ms. Karen Gore. Hello everyone. I am, in fact, no ruse here, I am Joseph Nathaniel Williams, Jr. at Appalachian State University, and I'm the intern here, of course, at the Lake Waccamaw Depot Museum. I'm glad that you all could make it here tonight, and I would like to thank each and every one of you for being here. Although I'm sure most of you are well acquainted with the topic of tonight's event, for those of you who may be otherwise unaware, we have our presentation on Samuel Chatham Potts, a local legend of Lake Waccamaw. He was a resident of Lake Waccamaw from the latter half of the 19th century and into the early 20th. The program is scheduled to last about an hour and is divided between a 45-minute lecture and a 15-minute question and answer session. The presentation consists of 3 topics. First, an introduction to the life of this mysterious and enigmatic figure, Samuel Chatham Potts. Second, a contextualization of his life within broader historical contexts, such as the Civil War, the Transportation Revolution. And third, an appeal to preserve historical artifacts, documents, and details so that our community's fascinating history and precious memories can be passed down from generation to generation to ensure that they are not forgotten. If you have any questions that could not be addressed during the scheduled time frame, please feel free to come and speak with me after the event when we'll be having refreshments, or if you simply would like to continue the conversation further. Before I begin, I would like to take this time to thank those who assisted me in hosting this production tonight. First, I would like to thank Dr. Jim Brooks, a former teacher of mine from Whiteville High School. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us tonight. He's at the Rotary Club meeting. But he was able to set up some of our technical equipment, our audio and visuals, and I would like to thank him for that. I would also like to thank Earl Hubbard and Matthew H. Thompson, whose independent investigations into the Bohemian Girl proved quite helpful to me in my own research and helped me quite a bit with this presentation here tonight. I would also like to thank Mrs. Ginger Littrell, former curator of the Lake Waccamaw Depot Museum. She put me in contact with some of the descendants of Samuel Chatham Potts, and I would like to thank those descendants themselves. Unfortunately, they couldn't be with us tonight because some of them are from Bowling Green, Kentucky, and from all the way up in Connecticut. I was able to get in contact with them, but I'll mention their names: Bob Potts, Diane Potts, Adam, as well as Elizabeth Potts. They were helpful and gracious enough to provide me some family details and memories. I would also like to finally thank our present curator, Mrs. Karen Gore, who spread word about this event through flyers and online posts to Facebook and by word of mouth. She also provided some of our delicious refreshments tonight, which I hope you all enjoy, and she encouraged me to host this event in the first place, and I would like to thank her for that. Without all these people's assistance, this program wouldn't have been possible, and I believe it would be only appropriate if we were to acknowledge their invaluable contributions to tonight's event with a well-deserved round of applause. Thank you. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to this gentleman, Samuel Chatham Potts. I first encountered Captain Potts one spring day at the local Lake Time Vintique store, which is just up the road from here. As my parents and I were perusing their wares, I happened to stumble across a quaint, unassuming 4x6-inch photograph in a black wooden frame. The frame was slightly scuffed and discolored in certain places, but was in otherwise good condition, and the photograph had a faded steel blue-green tint to it. In the foreground, you see the Bohemian Girl, a steamship, just captured by the photographer's camera and seems to be motionless there on the water. Aboard the ship, we have 3 gentlemen, one of which appears as nothing more than an elusive shroud hidden in the shade cast by the smokestack on the starboard side of the vessel. Another seated along the port side with his leg propped up along the ship's hull. And lastly, you have one gentleman towards the forefront of the boat. He's wearing what is clearly a bright white button-down dress shirt as it contrasts sharply with the dreary gray surroundings. He's wearing what seems to be a black hat. It's bedecked with a long, wide tie and strikes a resolutely confident pose. Hands on his hips, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, and chest puffed out ever so slightly. If one were to examine the photograph further, one would notice that the figure's face is oddly obscured, unlike the other visible gentleman seated to his left, which is, perhaps symbolically indicative of the mystery that continues to surround this man. I decided on an implacable impulse to purchase the photograph, and I brought it home with me. And brief conversation with the shop attendant revealed to me that this was the enigmatic figure, Samuel Chatham Potts, a former resident of Lake Waccamaw. For the next couple of months, the photograph sat on my desk at college. Occasionally, I would glance at it, remember that spring afternoon, and ponder whimsically about this man's life and who he might have been. Yet, for all intents and purposes, Captain Potts only existed within my imagination. I only knew his name, a couple of apocryphal and frankly quite doubtful anecdotes about his life, and not much else. That is, until I began my internship here at the Lake Waccamaw Depot Museum this summer. To my surprise, an entire exhibit was dedicated to this man. So I decided then and there that I would immerse myself in as much of the Potts folklore as possible. Samuel Chatham Potts was born in Brunswick County on October the 11th, 1847. Unfortunately, not much is known of his parents, Robert James Potts or Sarah Jane Pittman Potts, and nor is there much information about his childhood or adolescence. This, however, is to be expected. By no means would a boy who likely lived a commonplace life in a relatively rural and isolated country locale have compiled some sort of extensive historical record for himself. He apparently, however, received training as a telegrapher and was inducted into the Confederate bureaucracy sometime throughout the American Civil War. And this leads us to one of our most persistent rumors about Sam Potts, that he was the personal telegrapher for none other than Confederate General Robert E. Lee. Let me get my place. I found it rather hard to believe that such a prominent aide to the Marble Man himself would have been overlooked by scholars, but nevertheless, I was determined to discover the source of this myth. I knew of no better way to verify such a grandiose claim than by consulting the dauntingly massive official records of the War of Rebellion, which, mind you, this is an incomplete set. There's only 126 volumes as opposed to 128. I counted them. Twice, mind you. The official records were compiled by the United States government after the American Civil War in an attempt to document the correspondence between military officers, governmental bureaucrats, and other prominent figures associated with the conflict. Nearly each of these volumes consists of over 1,000 pages, so instead of driving to the nearest university that possesses a copy of these antiquated records, somehow gaining access to that university's special collections archive, and spending hours searching through the indices of each volume, I decided instead to search through an online database provided quite graciously by Ohio State University of these materials. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any records for a Samuel Potts or other related terms, but after scrolling and browsing through a few pages of Colonel Potts's, and Lieutenant Potts's, and Captain Potts's, I happened to stumble across something surprising. Out of the entire 128 volumes of the official records, there are a sum total of, almost dropped my clicker, there are a sum total of 5 entries two of which are most promising for our purposes tonight. They both are dated to August the 14th, 1864, and they were written by this gentleman, Lieutenant Colonel William Heron Taylor, who was the Assistant Adjutant General of the Confederacy at this period during the Civil War. And he would have been responsible with his position as Assistant Adjutant General for distributing important information to high-ranking military officers. And the first entry I'll share with you is as follows. Dated August the 14th, 1864, Mr. Potts, General Hampton is today on the cars from Richmond to Charlottesville. Send this to Richmond and request them to have it delivered en route if practicable. It is very desirable for General Hampton to get it. Signed, W.H. Taylor. And by this, W.H. Taylor refers to an enclosed document that accompanied this first telegram to our Mr. Potts, which was written, interestingly enough, by Robert E. Lee himself. And it is as follows. General W. Hampton, halt your command and return toward Richmond. Gregg's division is crossing at Deep Bottom. Send back an officer to ascertain position. Signed, R. E. Lee. And the second entry is a shorter follow-up telegram sent to Mr. Potts, and it is as follows. This must be sent promptly and forwarded at once from Richmond. Signed, W.H.T. There is an obvious sense of urgency that pervades these messages, and for good reason. The date of these two telegrams situates the contents described therein within the nearly year-long Richmond-Petersburg siege, which occurred during the latter stages of the American Civil War, specifically from June 19, 1864 to April 2nd of 1865. The Union General of the Army of the Potomac at this time, its de facto commander was, as we all know, General Ulysses S. Grant. And he was going up against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And after a series of strategically significant battles against Lee's Confederate forces, eventually, let me rephrase this. After a series of strategically significant battles against Confederate forces, Ulysses Grant eventually had to settle down for a siege. And we'll describe it as such. Despite these successes, these strategically significant battles that he had won in early 1864, after over a month of nearly non-stop fighting with the Confederates, and I'm going to forewarn you, the images you're about to see are quite graphic and are taken by Civil War photographers. After the nerve-wracking tree-to-tree skirmish at the Battle of the Wilderness in early May of 1864, at the grisly uphill firefight during a torrential downpour at the appropriately named Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania just a few weeks later, and the massacre that ensued when thousands of bluecoats stormed headlong into the heavily entrenched Confederate defensive positions at Cold Harbor, Union forces, quite frankly, refused to fight. Within a little over a month that had transpired from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, approximately 65,000 Union soldiers went missing, were wounded, or had died, which was over half the number of casualties the Union sustained in the previous 3 years of the conflict. In an effort to deal with the hand he had been dealt, Grant decided, instead of engaging the enemy, he would chip away at the Confederates' defenses and their elaborate trench system around Petersburg and Richmond to dislodge the Army of Northern Virginia, capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, and ultimately bring about an end to the Civil War. He vowed to President Abraham Lincoln that he would, quote, fight it out on this line if it takes all summer, end quote. And indeed it did, and quite longer than he expected. The siege, while less intense than recent weeks of fighting, was itself not devoid of any conflict. Most notable, perhaps, was the disastrous Union attempt to literally blow a hole in the Confederates' defenses at the Battle of the Crater on July 30th, 1864. This catastrophe owes its infamy to an otherwise unknown commander and former commander of the Army of the Potomac, Ambrose E. Burnside, who, in an attempt to salvage the reputation that he had acquired from prior mismanagement of the Army, attempted to with his harebrained scheme to dig 500 feet beneath the Confederates' defensive positions, plant and detonate explosives, and then rush into the trenches and overwhelm its occupants. Due to a botched execution of the plan and the substitution of inexperienced troops at the last minute, however, the Union strategy was ultimately foiled, but it was not necessarily the last. And this is where we come back to Sam Potts. The Union planned another assault for August the 14th, 1864, and if you'll recall, that's the date of the two aforementioned entries that are dated to August the 16th, 4th, addressed to our Mr. Potts. What would become the Second Battle of Deep Bottom began when Union General David McMurtry Gregg, whom Robert E. Lee identifies in his petition for reinforcements to fellow Confederate General Wade Hampton III, crosses a particular segment of the James River in Virginia, known as Deep Bottom, to engage with Confederate forces. After a week-long unsuccessful engagement with the enemy on August the 20th, the leader of this expedition in Virginia, General Winfield Scott Hancock, decides to retreat back across the James River and regroup with the rest of the Army of the Potomac. And while this was a relatively minor skirmish, comparatively speaking to other battles that occurred throughout the American Civil War, with less than 5,000 casualties and a strategic status quo as its outcome, it nevertheless proved significant for our purposes of retracing the life of Samuel Potts. For the remainder of the war in the Eastern Front, the Union forces made incremental gains against the Confederates and steadily forced them further and further westward, stretching their supply lines so thin that it ultimately snapped, and Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia was forced to abandon its defenses at Richmond and Petersburg. They raced the Army of the Potomac westward to ultimately Appomattox Courthouse, where on April the 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee, surrounded by Union forces, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. For all intents and purposes, the Civil War was now over, and the Union had won. Now, as to whether our non-specified Mr. Potts in the official records is in fact the same Mr. Potts with whom we're concerned with this evening is a matter of debate. But I'm confident that these cited entries that I've made known to you all, and also the folklore that Samuel Potts was Robert E. Lee's personal telegrapher, is evidence enough to tentatively support such a conclusion. At the very least, this gives us an explanation as to the potential origin of the myth that Samuel Potts was Lee's personal telegrapher. Given Lee's celebrated reputation as the near embodiment of Southern chivalry and gentility, and his possession of a military acumen unheard of and unprecedented before and since, and his practical deification after his death in the October of 1870, it's no wonder that we remember Samuel Potts as Lee's personal telegrapher. Potts himself likely wanted us to remember him that way. Shortly after the war, for reasons that remain unknown to us, Potts moved from his native Brunswick County to Lake Walkmore, in the adjacent Columbus County, in 1867. And on July 3rd, 1868, he married Miss Louise Smith of Whiteville, North Carolina, and they had 3 children together. Their firstborn was a daughter, Eliza, nicknamed Lassie Dunlevin Potts, who was born in the August of 1875. Then you have their second child together, the appropriately named Samuel Chatham Potts, Jr., born in the August of 1882. And lastly, their second son, Junius Smith Potts, who was born in the July of 1887. Now, unfortunately, there are no known photographs of Eliza as a young girl, but we do happen to have photographs of the Potts children. Here we have this photograph humorously entitled "The Candy Eaters," as these are a bunch of neighborhood children that had just gone to the Doddridge store, which is right behind them, purchase some candy for themselves. The photograph is dated to 1894, and here, lying in the grass, we have Junius Smith Potts. And then back here, in the back row to the far left, kind of secluded from the rest of them, is Samuel Chatham Potts, Jr. And behind Jr. can just vaguely be seen the old depot building that operated in the area throughout much of the 19th century, but unfortunately burned down in the mid-1890s. This, of course, necessitated the construction of a new depot. The very depot you all are sitting in tonight, or perhaps standing for some of those in the back. It was designed by Joseph F. Leitner, who was a prominent and well-respected architect who designed many buildings across the southern United States, along with the old Columbus County Courthouse building and the old Columbus County Jailhouse, which is now Anthony's Restaurant. And it was constructed by a local by the name of Herbert Smith and a team of builders in 1904. By then, the railroad that operated in the area was the Atlantic Coastline Railroad, which was really an amalgamation of 5 separate railroads that operated independently of one another during the antebellum period and semi-independently with one another after the Civil War. The first of which was the Petersburg Railroad, which was chartered in 1830 and first opened to the public in 1833. Shortly thereafter came the Richmond and Petersburg Railroad, another Virginia-based railroad company. Then we have 2 other railroads. We have the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, and not to be confused with its counterpart, the Wilmington and Manchester Railroad, which operated throughout much of North Carolina. And then finally, we had the misleadingly named Northeastern Railroad, which operated throughout much of South Carolina. It was chartered in 1851, and it began its operation in 1856. Now, after the Civil War, a Baltimore investor by the name of William T. Walters began to invest in these 5 businesses and began to consolidate them into one that, by the turn of the century, would become, that was fancy, wasn't it, the Atlantic Coastline. And the Atlantic Coastline, at its greatest extent, if we were to look at this map here, spanned over 5,000 miles of track from as far north as Richmond, Virginia, as far south as Jacksonville, Florida, and as far west as Montgomery, Alabama, essentially covering the entire southeastern seaboard. The Atlantic Coastline was in operation until 1967, when it merged with another railroad company to form the Seaboard Coastline, which itself operated until 1983, when it merged with yet another company. About a decade beforehand, however, in 1974, the Seaboard Coastline decommissioned this depot and sold it to the town of Lake Walkmore. And originally, the municipal government had intentions of using this building as a storage facility, especially for the surplus goods that would be brought into the town for the upcoming bicentennial celebration in 1976. However, through the efforts of the Lake Walkmore Women's Club, which was spearheaded by Mrs. Betty Timberlake, they were able to purchase the building from the government and have it dedicated as the museum, as it is today. It was first opened to the public on July 10th, 1977, so throughout this year we've been celebrating our 40 years of operation. After the new depot was constructed, Sam Potts continued to work there as the telegraph operator, but not for long. The census of 1910, as of the census of 1910, Samuel Potts is no longer recorded as the railroad agent. Instead, his youngest son, Junius Smith Potts, is identified as the clerk on that census. He likely shadowed his father at work on occasion, took up an interest in the railroad, learned the ins and outs of the business, and gradually became involved with the operations there at the depot. This granted Samuel Potts a little more time for leisurely pursuits, perhaps. He was considered a Renaissance man of sorts, with varied interests in photography, medicine, jewelry, and of course, his pride and joy, the Bohemian Girl. His steamship, which ferried locals and tourists alike on pleasure cruises, fishing trips such as this one, and hunting expeditions across Lake Walkmore and its waterways. Sam Potts began operating the Bohemian Girl in the 1880s. The name of the ship was likely derives from the Irish composer Michael William Balfe's play, or rather opera, of the same name, which premiered in London November the 27th of 1843. Now, while it might seem odd that a rural of a relatively isolated county in North Carolina is acquainted with the fine arts of British theater, this seeming discrepancy is explained away by one of the facts known about his mother, one of the few facts known about Sarah Jane Denbighton Potts. She was born in Leeds, England, and she happened to live there for as long as up until 1871, which is one of the England censuses. They have her recorded as living in Leeds, England. And perhaps, this is a bit conjectural on my part, but perhaps his mother told him stories of the opera that struck an interest within him as a child, or perhaps Samuel Potts went to England for a couple of days or so to visit his mother, happened to go to an opera house, and saw a performance of the Bohemian Girl. Now, this remains a matter of speculation on my part, but I believe it gives us a little bit of an idea of how the connection between the boat and the opera might have come about. People came from far and wide to little old Lake Walkmore to enjoy the fresh waters and to take a ride on Sam Potts' steamboat. One person known only to us as Stray Georgian records their experiences in the following letter. A few days ago, it was my good fortune to take a trip on this beautiful lake as a guest of the genial Captain Potts on the Bohemian Girl with a party of friends. To say that I enjoyed it is to draw it mildly. Enjoy? Why, I was charmed. In fact, the English vocabulary fails me when I attempt to express my pleasure. The captain is a whole host within himself, and the Bohemian Girl skims the water of the placid lake like a thing of life. The lake is one of the most beautiful sheets of water my eyes ever beheld, and the fishing, well, everybody has a fish tale to tell, but I will say that I caught them so fast that I could not count them. One of my counters said 175. The man or woman who comes in reach of this beautiful lake and does not make a trip with the captain in the Bohemian Girl has missed one of the greatest pleasures accorded to us mortals here below. Au revoir and Godspeed to you and the Bohemian Girl, my gallant captain. Now, if I do say so myself, that does sound like a bit of an overstatement, but I've heard that Georgians have a tendency to embellish themselves every now and then. No offense to any Georgians that we might have in the crowd tonight. But perhaps beneath the veneer of this letter's grandiloquent verbosity, the message nevertheless remains true. Our stray Georgians certainly enjoyed themselves on this fishing trip aboard the Bohemian Girl. One article that I was able to discover in the Wilmington Messenger, published on July 6th of 1893, describes the 4th of July festivities at Lake Walkamaw and dedicates the following 2 paragraphs to the entire 4-paragraph editorial. And it is as follows. The original and only Potts, Samuel Chatham Potts, Esquire, theologian, poet, musician, telegrapher, navigator, and photographer, and on whose shoulders the mantles of Isaac Walton and Daniel Boone have fallen, was on the lake in the command of the steam yacht Mascot. He was ready and willing to take parties out for a sail, and in the language of the gallant commander, quote, the Mascot would plow the brine for the small sum of 2 bits, silver not refused, notwithstanding the recent action of India and the probable repeal of the Sherman Bill, end quote. With his sweetest smile, he invited the messenger reporter to plow the brine with him. But a wicked gleam shot from his eye. I just lost my place. With his sweetest smile, he invited the messenger reporter to plow the brine with him. But a wicked gleam shot from his eye as he remembered how he crammed overripe mulberries down his back in the Little Red Schoolhouse on 5th Street when we were boys together, and were thrashed daily on general principles by that good old soul, Aunt Maggie McLeod. Recollecting the mulberry episode about the same time, we prudently declined with thanks and escaped his vengeance. Undoubtedly, of course, some passengers didn't enjoy themselves quite as well as our aforementioned stray Georgian, perhaps. And for those whom I would imagine were either especially rude or unsuspectingly naive passengers, our mischievous mustachioed mariner, there's alliteration for you, had a way to deal with the unruliness, or simply to arouse a few laughs at another's expense. Some locals have attested to stories of Sam Potts, and that he would occasionally convince a passenger or 2 aboard the Bohemian Girl to disembark the vessel onto a piece of debris that had been lodged in the lake, perhaps to have their picture taken at a distance. Now imagine their surprise when he sped off in his steamboat, sometimes leaving the passengers out there in the middle of the lake for as long as an hour or more. Perhaps the messenger reporter was right to fear the vengeful wrath of Mr. Potts that summer day. Operating the Bohemian Girl was not a solo endeavor on the part of Mr. Potts, especially as he grew older. The census of 1900 documents a Charles Warner, or alternatively Charles Warren, as census records can be notoriously difficult to read. Very few details are known of Charles Warner, other than that he and his parents were born in North Carolina, and that he was the personal fireman for the Bohemian Girl in case any fires were to break out on board the vessel. He was likely a local of Lake Walkamaw and perhaps assisted Mr. Potts in other tasks around the Potts household. Additionally, Charles Beersgalt, a resident of Lake Walkamaw, was asked by Mrs. Betty Timberlake to compile a document of brief reminiscences of his during his boyhood in the early 20th century here at Lake Walkamaw. And he mentions, quote, a little colored boy who assisted Sam Potts on the Bohemian Girl. As a matter of fact, Mr. Galt, although he would have been too young to, or rather he wouldn't have been born at this time to have really witnessed this anecdote, he provides a brief account of his relationship with his mischievous little assistant. Quote, Captain Potts and his little colored boy were out there fishing on this occasion, but couldn't be seen for the moment. The visiting ladies, and these visiting ladies are a group of young women that have come to visit his daughter Eliza, and we'll return to them later. The visiting ladies were invited to Yoo-hoo in order to hear the nice echo, but just as they did so, Captain Potts' young companion evidently did something to arouse his boss's ire, and the apparent echo which came wafting in off the lake was not exactly the Yoo-hoo which had gone out. It was Captain Potts' vigorously profane verbal volley launched at the hapless little fellow, and, to say the very least, gave the good ladies quite a start. As to who this young boy exactly was remains a mystery. However, this hasn't stopped us from postulating some possibilities in recent years. There's this one young lad over here on the right-hand side whom we only know by his nickname, Buckshot, and he's certainly a contender for the assistance that Samuel Potts had on his boat, but if we were to look over to the left-hand side of the screen, you can see an outboard motor on a boat. And although the outboard motors were invented during Samuel Potts' lifetime, they weren't common until the 1920s, so this places him a decade after Samuel Potts' death. Another possibility is this young boy, George, nicknamed Prime Powell, who's seen here seated outside the Oaks residence, which was the home of the Galt family, prominent family here at Lake Walkemaw, also in the 1920s. So the same issue with Buckshot's photograph exists for George Powell's photograph as well, unfortunately. So there still remains some uncertainty as to exactly Sam Potts' assistant might have been. I mentioned previously that Samuel Potts, as a modern Renaissance man of varied and diverse interests, also happened to dabble in a little bit of photography. And I neglected to mention to you over the course of this presentation so far that some of the pictures that you've seen, with some exceptions of course, were taken by Samuel Potts himself. And while this might sound like a blasé statement in our technology-saturated society where the selfie reigns supreme, consider this. Somehow, Samuel Potts was able to devise a way to take pictures of himself without anyone's assistance before the invention of the time-release photograph. And examples of such include this photograph, and we've already seen this one before, but this one I find especially interesting, if you'll allow me a bit of a digression. This is actually the front of a postcard which was addressed to F.B. Galt, one of the Galt family members that I had mentioned of previously. If you were to look right here, well, first of all, let's identify our notable figures. Here we have Samuel Chatham Potts and his youngest son, Junius Smith Potts. You can identify them as their luggage has their initials inscribed on there. Here we have another inscription at the bottom of the photograph, and it says, "Goodbye to Vade Mecum." Now, as to what Vade Mecum means, it's a colloquial phrase of Latin that simply refers to a reference book that would have someone's names, dates, addresses, numbers, things that would be needed to be consulted on a ready basis. But literally, the Latin phrase means, "go with me." Now, as to what the entire phrase itself means, "goodbye to Vade Mecum," I'm at a loss for words. I've searched online. I haven't been able to find any possibilities. But my best guess would be, goodbye to Vade Mecum, goodbye to the things with which we're familiar, we're going off to another land. And in this case, if we were to look over here, unfortunately you can't see this inscription. It says, "I will be back in a week." So my best guess is I was able to search through some newspapers, either the Wilmington Morning Star or the Wilmington Messenger, and there was actually some personal paragraphs that were put out for Samuel Potts and Junius Smith Potts, advertising that they had come into the town. So I believe that this postcard is illustrative of their trip to Wilmington. Then we have these two photographs, which I find to be quite interesting. Here we have Samuel Potts here seated on the shoreline of the lake, and here we have one of his sons in a boat behind him. And here, this road right here, as a matter of fact, he's seated on the ditch bank. This road right here is Flemington Drive, the road that you all undoubtedly drove up on when you came here to the museum tonight. And what I find interesting about these two photographs, and the reason that I juxtapose them with one another, is if you were to look closely, you can see that although these pictures were taken years apart from one another, perhaps as many as 10, 20 years apart from one another, Sam Potts nevertheless has the same posture in both pictures. And if you were to look at this picture, just out in the distance can be seen the Bohemian Girl out there on the lake. Let me get back to my spot. While mostly known for its role as a leisure ship, it's also possible that the Bohemian Girl was used for a more laborious purpose as well. Here in this photograph are two piers, and the one that is closest to the photographer is the docking pier for Samuel Potts's Bohemian Girl. If you were to look over to the left-hand side of the image, you can see the Bohemian Girl just entering out of the waters, or rather on the shoreline. And then the pier that is furthest from the photographer is the docking pier for Short and Beers Lumber Company, which was founded by Colonel Henry Blunt Short, who was a former resident of Williamston, North Carolina, and Charles Oscar Beers, who was a native of Connecticut, who came to Lake Waccamaw, and they happened to found their own independent lumber operations, and they merged them together, as I had mentioned, in 1869. Short died in 1886 and bequeathed his share of the business, which amounted to 2/3, to his son, Henry Bascom Short. Give me a moment. Henry Bascom Short and Samuel Potts were evidently good friends with one another, as evidenced by this photograph. Here, if you were to look on the left-hand side of the screen, here we have our first picture of Eliza. She's kind of bashfully holding some food in front of her face. Then you have Samuel Potts and his wife, along with Henry Bascom Short's youngest daughter, Marguerite Short Tad. They're all playfully posing for the camera, toasting one another. Then here on the rightmost side of the screen, you have Mary Allen Mears Short, Henry Bascom Short's wife, and Henry Bascom Short himself, kind of rigidly staring into the camera. And how such a comical joker and jester such as Samuel Potts became friends with, a stolid, straight-laced businessman such as Henry Bascom Short, I have no clue. But they evidently must have been good friends with one another to host this picnic together and to perhaps go into business together. It's believed by some that the Bohemian Girl not only ferried passengers across Lake Waccamaw, but also ferried supplies to and from the lumber company's operative sites. This belief derives from the especially amicable relations between Short and Potts, the proximity of their two piers, as well as the presumed difficulty in moving the materials across the lake through alternative modes of transportation such as poling. However, without any photographic or written evidence, such a conclusion remains a tenuous one at best. Nevertheless, what remains certain is that the bond between Short and Potts was undoubtedly a close one. But to be sure, the bond was much closer between Henry Bascom Short and his beloved wife, Miss Mary Allen Mears Short, who unfortunately came to an untimely death in the June of 1908 after a prolonged bout with pneumonia. Potts's dear friend was deeply troubled by his wife's death, and he went as far north as New York to seek a physician's assistance for his depression, and he experienced some mild improvements only to return back to Lake Waccamaw and to relapse into his depression. His obituary, which ran the day after his death, is as follows. His health greatly impaired for several months, and his spirit much broken since the recent death of his wife, to whom he was most tenderly devoted. In a fit of melancholy yesterday morning at 7 o'clock at his home at Lake Waccamaw, North Carolina, Mr. Henry B. Short, one of the most prominent and highly esteemed citizens in this section of the state, committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. Samuel Potts was Henry Bascom Short's neighbor, and he undoubtedly heard that gunshot that early morning on January the 13th, 1909, when his dear friend took his own life. It wasn't long thereafter when Samuel Potts died on June 1st, 1910, at the age of 62. An obituary ran the following day, and it reads, "Friends in the city of Mr. Sam C. Potts, a prominent citizen of Lake Waccamaw, were grieved last night to learn of his death, which occurred at his home. This information will be received with the deepest regret by the hundreds of friends of the deceased here. Mr. Potts suffered a stroke of paralysis several months ago. Yesterday he was up and seemed to be in his usual health. Last night he retired at his usual time, and shortly after he was found unconscious. He passed away in a few minutes. Mr. Potts had been a resident of Lake Waccamaw for a number of years. He is survived by his widow and 3 children, Miss Lassie Potts, Mr. June Potts, short for Junius, of Lake Waccamaw, and Mr. Samuel C. Potts of Panama. Much sympathy will be felt for the bereaved relatives in their sorrow." A commemorative gravestone was erected at the Whiteville Memorial Cemetery for Samuel Potts and his children. As to what became of the Bohemian Girl, remains a mystery. As was common practice in the early 20th century, such a small vessel as the Bohemian Girl was likely scuttled somewhere out on Lake Waccamaw, Big Creek, or the Waccamaw River, the places where it and its captain would frequent. The steam engine, however, as it was a fairly expensive piece of equipment and could prove to be quite durable, was likely refurbished for some other purpose on some other boat. This allows for an interesting and light-hearted digression, as there very well may have been more than one Bohemian Girl. Based on verbal testimonies of some local figures such as John McNeil and Frank Galt, physical evidence recovered from the docking pier where the Bohemian Girl would operate, as well as photographic evidence, there might have been two Bohemian Girls. McNeil and Galt both independently attested of stories that the original Bohemian Girl had caught fire near the pier one day due to a steam engine malfunction, which of course would have necessitated the construction of a second boat and the possible hiring of Charles Warner, the fireman for the Bohemian Girl. Physical evidence unearthed near the site of the Bohemian Girl's operation revealed sunken artifacts consistent with the designs of a steamboat. And lastly, photographic evidence also seems to corroborate such a claim, as the retroactively deduced dimensions of the boat show that there are two separate sets of photographs that show two separate dimensions for the boat. If we could one day perhaps recover some of the remnants of the original boat, or if we could perhaps get some of the original pieces of the second boat, that would be great additions to our museum, I believe. As the obituary mentions, Samuel Potts was survived by his wife, Miss Louise Smith Potts, his daughter, Eliza Dunbibbin Potts, as well as his son, Samuel Chatham Potts Jr. and Junius Smith Potts. His wife died in July of 1918. She died at the age of 68 years old. Tragically, however, the only daughter, Eliza, died before her mother 4 years previously in the February of 1914 at the young age of 39 after struggling with a lifelong illness with tuberculosis. Her illness likely compelled her to affiliate herself with a new religious movement at the time period known as Christian Science, which